When Ozu died in 1963, he was still widely considered one of the best and most acclaimed directors in the national industry. Revered for his refined observational cinematography and quiet but profound treatment of familial themes, Ozu is internationally considered perhaps the archetypal Japanese director, both anticipating and then exemplifying the gentle humanism that would dominate cinema in the 1940s and 50s. His films would first start to get some international distribution in the late 1950s and have remained perennial world cinema classics, influencing international directors such as Wim Wenders, Paul Schrader and Hu Shaoxuan. He was also roundly dismissed by many of the greatest new Japanese directors of the 60s, who revitalised the national cinema in the image of a young, both post-imperial and post-war generation. Shohei Imamura was assigned as Ozu's assistant on the major films Early Summer, The Flavour of Green Tea Over Rice and Tokyo Story. It was a common occurrence in Japan of pairing potential future directors with established hands. He later remarked, "I wouldn't just say that I wasn't influenced by Ozu, I would say that I didn't want to be influenced by him." Imamura would quit this enviable position in favour of working under the much less respected comedy director, Yuzo Kawashima, whose often raucous films usually concerned the neglected in society and would prove to be far more of a mentor. Imamura's films would rebuke the idealised version of Japan typified by Ozu's ossified domestic dramas. Often declaring himself an anthropological director, it's through this lens that critical approaches to Imamura's work are characterised, as he interrogated the nature of the national Japanese character through a long career. Film historian James Quandt succinctly introduces Imamura's portrayal of Japan as rejecting the official version of Japan and its emphasis on order, conformity, ritual, tradition, and technological efficiency. In its place, Imamura portrays Japan as a tumultuous world in which chaos triumphs over civilization, in which voyeurism, violence, fetishism, superstition, and incest are as unremarkable as they are recurrent. 1 year after Ozu's final film, Imamura released The Insect Woman, a chaotic and disturbing portrait of the life of a woman, Tomei Matsuki, from her birth in 1918 up to the present day. Imamura constructs continuities between the almost feudal, pre-industrial life of Tomei's family, that work on the land, and the modern urban life she tries to escape to. Continuities that also persist through generations. Despite the veneer of modernity, industrial capitalism, and the democratic reforms of the American occupation, Tomei finds herself and subsequently her daughter in a pseudo-ancestral relationship, just as they were with the man who raised them. Whilst Tomei was sold by her mother for her services as a maid and sexual servant to the landowner's son, so does Tomei herself act as a solicitor and manager of a group of call girls, industrialising the exploitation she was a victim of. More ambiguous is Imamura's treatment of the religious or superstitious customs Tomei observes. The primitive prayers to a mountain god in the countryside is less closely mirrored by a cultish, organised religion in Tokyo, where members are recruited to sell its trinkets like a pyramid scheme. Tomei seems to find real solace from a group confession, although the ability for her to absolve herself of sins in this manner is possibly just an enabler of her increasingly cruel behaviour. It's clear throughout that although she becomes increasingly indefensible as she returns her own exploitation onto others, Imamura's respect or interest in Tomei only grows. At the time, Imamura described this quite merciless character portrait as a study of a human living an inhuman life, thinking only of herself and ignoring her surroundings, which would allow him to explore what it means to be a Japanese. However, there is a particularly vital element that saves the film, sustaining a strain of emphatic humanity and energy, and is instantly recognisable in a number of Imamura works. Brilliantly summarised by historian Michael Raine, who contrasts Imamura against typical depictions of female suffering in Japanese cinema. Raine notes that Imamura focuses on female frustration rather than male guilt, leading to films that present more directly the disordered subjectivity of the women who endure exploitation. Tomei's own sexual desires and agency are exploited against her. She is a character with potency rather than an object of simple aesthetic tragedy. Contrasting this with Ozu's heroines whose noble self-sacrifices are entirely bereft of agency, instead only the silent resolve to succeed to roles prescribed by an elderly patriarch, a resolve Ozu's own depiction of which is melancholy but ultimately entirely admiring and reverent. The disordered subjectivity mentioned by Raine is reflected in the chaotic formal boldness of the insect woman, in which freeze-framed narration, documentary footage, and abrupt jumps in time interrupt the narrative. Scenes themselves are often chaotic, long takes with characters lunging out of the widescreen frame or jumbled into crowded spaces, further obscured by objects or shadow. The Insect Woman includes a particularly long take in which Imamura allows actors to rampage all the way off screen before re-emerging. From his time as Ozu's assistant, Imamura took particular umbrage at the way Ozu dictated performances to his actors. "I work with actors in a very different way from Ozu. He instructs them on every detail. Go forward 3 steps, take the phone and lean to the right 30 degrees, speak after 3 light breaths, etc. I try to communicate more openly with them." The Insect Woman would become a surprise hit as well as winning many of the highest awards in 1963, indicating a commercial and critical appetite for more challenging, incisive films. Depicting a complex and evolving Japanese identity, Imamura would continue to make bold experimental films, attempting to deconstruct the impact of national identity, culture and history, becoming one of the country's premier art filmmakers. Nagisa Oshima was commissioned to create a documentary on the history of Japanese cinema for the BFI in 1995. When it comes to the emergence of the Japanese New Wave, he introduces his motivations at the time as a conscious effort to work in total contrast to the predominant style and subject matter of the era.
私は過去の日本映画は戦争、貧困、そして家と社会の封建性の被害者である民衆の意識に引きずられすぎていると考えていた。民衆が被害者意識を持つのは仕方がない。作家までが持ってどうする。作家は人間が自由になる道を探すべきではないのか。たとえ苦しくとも、たとえ傷つこうとも。
Both the feudal nature of relations within the Japanese family and the trap of directors sympathising with the national victim complex rather than seeking to liberate their audience could be squarely aimed at many directors, but certainly Ozu would be amongst the very most pertinent targets. Oshima's 1971 film The Ceremony deconstructs the traditionalist familial structure across the post-war period of Ozu's most celebrated films. Told largely in a series of episodes, each surrounding a wedding, funeral, or anniversary celebration, this film in several ways could not be further removed from Ozu's family dramas. In an Ozu film, we would only observe the quiet moments between large events. In a film about marrying off the daughter of a family, the wedding itself will take place off-screen. However, Oshima painfully depicts the often dehumanising formal rituals of traditional Japanese ceremonies as a critique of the power structures and prejudices they seek to sanctify. He extends his critique beyond just interfamiliar relationships, but also as a representation of the nationalistic, even racial supremacist currents persisting beyond the imperialist period. Whilst the older generation continues to harbour these regressive ideals, the young generation are depicted as traumatised and disturbed. They may spiritually reject the older generation, but they are nonetheless unable to find their own meaning, left to violence, incest and suicide.
嫌だ。僕はうつまっていくんだ。
Afterwards, it's hard to re-immerse yourself in Ozu's image of intergenerational understanding and dutifulness, a veneer that is shattered, revealing underlying power dynamics, whether enacted benevolently or not.
お父さんお母さん何とおっしゃるか知らんけど、俺は不賛成だね。
だけど私。
Ozu's final film, An Autumn Afternoon, was released in 1962. It's a quintessential Ozu film in every respect, telling the story of an aging widowed father, Shohei, who slowly decides that it is time to marry off his daughter, Michiko, who has essentially been working as a maid for him and her brother. The father decides this after a long introspection on his own age and position, brought on by the nagging of his drinking companion, combined with the example of their old teacher, whose own daughter never married and is trapped looking after him. Michiko is given this amount of consideration in a roundabout way, but is afforded even less in terms of personal agency. Shohei essentially announces that it's time for her to be married after he has had his private introspective crisis.
しかしね、
まだいいまだいいって言ってるうちにいつの間にか年を取るんだ。
Shohei and his eldest son, Koichi, interview a man after there's a suggestion that Michiko likes him. However, he is found to be already engaged, the news of which Michiko takes with a quiet dignity, and almost literally in the same breath, agrees to meeting with Shuhei's proposed backup suitor. She's promptly married to this suitor who was never shown, in a wedding ceremony also not shown, making use of the aforementioned cinematic ellipsis that Ozu is famous for. In a dual viewing with the ceremony, an autumn afternoon makes for a disturbing watch. Whilst Ozu venerates the apparent self-abnegation of the father and dutifulness of the daughter, it becomes impossible not to see the power dynamics at play here.
もっとがっかりするかと思ってたけどね。
案外平気な顔してましたね。
よかったよ。
Shuhei's self-abnegation is fueled by an unhappy, pretentious example, so really it's hardly as selfless as it seems, especially considering the maid role Michiko has been playing to the family of men who come home drinking every night, and the resulting brusqueness in which he marries her off to prevent future mutual misery, seemingly without much thought to her individual, now separated future. Ozu's ellipsis of the wedding suddenly reads as turning away from the crime. Other aspects also become more malicious than intended. For example, the imperial naval background of Shohei, whilst perhaps intended to demonstrate the shifting generations in a slightly comedic manner, now seem to hearken to Shohei maintaining the feudal nature of relations, to borrow Oshima's phrase. Such a reading of An Autumn Afternoon as a totally right-wing, dehumanising and misogynistic film that nostalgically recalls the greater repression of previous eras would be to ignore the pacifying effects of Ozu's redeeming humanism and good humour. Perhaps more interesting than the main plot is the subplot between the eldest son and his wife, Mariko. Initially it seems this will be a pretentious example of the dangers of marriage, to counter-mirror the example to Shohei that instigated his course of action. But as these scenes continue, you get the sense of the love between Mariko and Koichi with a comic naturalism that increasingly comes through. This subplot gives just a little room for ambiguity to the shape of the marriage that Michiko has been pushed into. Perhaps there is the possibility that she has not just been handed over as a maid to another man in a feudal tradition, just as lost as the protagonists of the ceremony.
いいのよ。この辺で買っとかないと。あとうるさいもん。よかったわね、兄さん。
Nevertheless, the passivity of the characters, emphasised in compositions of static boxes, becomes truly disturbing with the slightest deconstruction. David Desser identifies this effect as part of the transcendental nature of many of the post-war prestige movies, from directors such as Ozu and Mizoguchi, films that emphasise transcendental narratives and spirituality, in Ozu's case specifically the transitory nature of individuals juxtaposed against the timelessness of nature. Mythologically tinged storytelling that emphasised history as an endless cycle of life, death, rebirth, rather than as the product of economic, social and political forces. A reliance on de-centred narrative, episodic plotting and a cyclical view of life can encourage a disbelief in the validity of individual action, a devaluation in the idea of change. It's only natural to see how an individualist artist like Oshima, enthused with the energies of organised revolutionary political action, would reject this spiritual interpretation of history as well as any art that encouraged a disinterest in social conditions and changes. Desser concludes that, thus Ozu, typically called Japan's most Japanese director, emerges as one of its most conservative ones. An acceptance of life's problems through the elicitation of a where is also the acceptance of the political status quo. Michiko seems like the embodiment of this tendency. She is Ozu's idealised image of a new female generation, one much like his idealised images of the previous generations. But Ozu's work did not always exclusively depict these passive, stultified notions. He once made modern films depicting a rapidly changing and chaotic society. Dragnet Girl is a 1933 gangster movie with a central criminal couple fated to an inevitably doomed end. Joji is an ex-boxer who is now the ringleader of a small gang. Takiko is his gangster's mole and wins his favour by seducing wealthy men, making them vulnerable to Joji's gang, who rob and blackmail them. One of the more interesting aspects of Dragnet Girl is that the perspective of the film changes several times, between Takiko, Yoji, Hiroshi, an impressionable youth trying to get into the gang, and Kazuko, his earnest sister trying to keep him away from a life of crime. But eventually Tokiko emerges as the most central character, the one whose agency propels the narrative and whose pathos and suffering crystallises the emotional complexity of the film. In addition to this most un-Ozu-like protagonist is the un-Ozu-like cinematography, long tracking shots filled with hectic detail and motion, the occasional very high angle, and moody, more expressionistic lighting. Startling after viewing An Autumn Afternoon, which contains literally zero camera moves. In Dragnet Girl, even Ozu's trademark pillow shots are often composed with dramatic camera movements. Not to say that Ozu's idiosyncrasies are entirely undetectable. The aforementioned subtly shifting through a series of perspectives, unusual in the contemporary Hollywood gangster films, was of course employed by Ozu very frequently throughout his career. A pivotal scene between Tokiko and Yoji demonstrates how un-Ozu-like the character of Tokiko and her emotional freedom is, but this scene also simultaneously starts to employ more of Ozu's distinctive formal choices, with the shot-reverse shot playing almost straight to the character, separating the actors individually and causing eyelines to wander off into the middle distance. And so watching Dragnet Girl is strange. There's an anachronistic feeling to the film, as it largely looks as though it was shot on a Hollywood backlot. The movie is not set in America, but looks totally different from the Japan that we see in Ozu's later films, even when he would depict Tokyo or industrial locations. Dragnet Girl was of course made during the height of the Hollywood gangster movie craze, between the invention of the talkie and the Hays Code, but it's also somewhat of a precursor to later crime couple films, like They Live by Night or Gun Crazy. In the background of several scenes you can see posters for American movies. This was actually something that Ozu enjoyed inserting into many of his films of this era, as well as using the westernised pseudonym of James Mackey for his screenplay contributions. This is to say that Dragnet Girl is far from a one-off. Ozu largely made particularly American-style films during his early career, including student comedies such as I Flunked But, which goes so far as to directly lift gags and mannerisms from the films of Harold Lloyd. Towards the end of this period, he seemed to become openly introspective about the American influence on his work and Japanese society more generally. In Woman of Tokyo, the protagonist, Shikeiko, goes to see the comedy anthology film If I Had a Million. Ozu shows a lengthy passage from the Ernst Lubitsch vignette, Lubitsch being one of Ozu's favourite filmmakers, and Shikeiko excitingly saves the programme and tells her brother about it when she gets home. So why did Ozu abandon this style and subject matter? Japan's turn to an increasingly mandated nationalistic culture could surely have been a factor, however Ozu's films would have been a far larger correction than the censor would have mandated. His formal evolution, discarding many of his technically accomplished techniques, is also unexplained by these larger industry trends. One final detractor from the new wave I would like to introduce is Yoshige Yoshida. Yoshida, as well as Oshima, Imamura and of course Ozu himself, started his career at Shoshiku. His early new wave films have not had the same level of availability outside of Japan, however. Rather, it's his later experimental trilogy of independent films about radical politics that he is most known for internationally. When Ozu released The End of Summer in 1961, Yoshida, still very early in his career at Shojiku, wrote a critique of his own studio's elder master for a film magazine. He took aim at Ozu's depiction of young people in the film and criticised the poor attempt at appealing to a young audience. This article could only add to the developing notion that Ozu was an anathema to his own studio's self-conscious attempt to revitalise waning audience attendance with a new generation of innovative directors. Decades later, in 1993, when Yoshida is 60, the same age as Ozu when he died in 1963, he releases a TV documentary, re-evaluating Ozu's work and what he meant to cinema, later expanding his thesis into a book that was thankfully translated into English, intriguingly titled Ozu's Anti-Cinema. Yoshida's analysis goes through Ozu's filmography chronologically, and whilst he nominally focuses on Ozu's approach to style and symbolism, his writing extends even further. He poetically speculates as to Ozu's metaphysical conceptions on the nature of cinema and image making, and ultimately how Ozu's films, just like those of the New Wave, were a conscious rejection of cinematic conventions. Let's look at the analysis of a scene from I Was Born But, an early transitional film from 1932, in which characteristic Ozu-like aspects are deconstructed. The scene shows the two schoolboys, who are the protagonists of the film, walking disconsolately home after witnessing their father's embarrassing kowtowing to his boss. Yoshida picks this scene to demonstrate what he calls repetition and difference. The brothers vividly display another kind of repetition and difference when they walk along the road. The elder brother takes off his jacket violently and carries it over his shoulder. Seeing this, the younger brother takes off his jacket and carries it over his shoulder. The brothers walk away, each with a hand in a pocket. Such an action is not typical of a child, but it reminds the viewers of a gesture by workers when they demonstrate their dissatisfaction. The young brothers accurately imitate the behaviour of a worker carrying his jacket over his shoulder and sticking his hand in his pocket. At the same time, viewers cannot overlook another clear difference. The brothers unconsciously imitate a typical worker's gesture and transform themselves into adult workers, but their small bodies, filled with anger and dissatisfaction, make their gesture a far more convincing and poignant critique of society than any protests coming from adult workers or political demonstrations. Since they are innocent children, viewers have to interpret a clearly different meaning from the same gesture as coming from adults. This is precisely the joy of watching motion pictures, and the joy of experiencing the creation of new meaning in visual images. Ozu allows the audience to create meaning by bringing their own comparisons and contrasts, rather than artificially constructing a symbol meant to be interpreted in only the one way which the director has in mind. Yoshida identifies this instinct in opposition to standard cinematic meaning-making, and so defines it as anti-cinema. Yoshida further insists that Ozu's matured and carefully developed cinematic language was always a noble but painfully insufficient attempt at creating a true reflection of the real world, an epiphany he came to by way of his disgust at his early imitative work. Many film directors tend to dramatise the themes and the problems of the real world as a way to attract the attention of audiences. Why did Ozu-san, on the contrary, persist in such passive or negative ways of cinematic expression like imitation, repetition, or trivial differences that were not likely to stimulate a viewer's mind? This is probably because of the distress and despair Ozu-san felt when he first encountered motion pictures. Ozu-san knew that cinema is not concerned with the blessed new creation, but is simply an act of copying the actual world. For him, a movie camera must have resembled a useless tool, an illicit machine that would merely confuse the actual conditions of the world. For Ozu-san, capturing landscapes and human beings in the frame of a camera meant adding to, playing with, raping and destroying the actual state of the world. Here, Yoshida's analysis combines the metaphysical with the existential. This world is not meaningful or meaningless, it simply stands there. When Ozu-san looks at this world through a movie camera for the first time, he must have felt that way. The world is self-sufficient and self-sustaining before the camera comes to invade it. The world would have been maintained in this way if Ozu's eyes, by way of a camera, did not intrude upon it. To him, splicing the world into pieces, assigning meaning to these pieces, and connecting them together so as to make a motion picture were hypocritical acts. Films were merely fakes, showing the actual world as if it was still alive when it was already horribly damaged, severed and dead. Therefore, Ozu-san's filmmaking style can be seen as an act of penance for the sins of his camera's assault on the world. His filmmaking was probably based on his virtue, his passive and self-renouncing attitude. To theorise that Ozu abandoned the modern techniques of dramatic subject matter dominant in Hollywood cinema and elsewhere as an act of penance for the sins of the camera on the world is perhaps a struggle for more conventional film historians. However, it's impossible to deny that Ozu showed an ever-increasing conviction and commitment to his style as he developed it. I also think that Ozu's preoccupation with replicating or depicting life through banalities that culminate in a final impression left to be constructed by the audience member is how the critiques of Ozu's work from both the New Wave filmmakers and myself were arrived at. For viewers and filmmakers obsessed with highly conceptual cinema that works through symbolism and dichotomy, cinema, in the case of the New Wave, often designed to agitate audiences. Ozu's rejection of either symbolic or dramatic statements in both form and content is confounding. Whereas we heard David Desser earlier ascribe to passive camera and subjectless compositions as part of Ozu's transcendental acceptance of the timelessness of nature and the inevitability of life and death, Yoshida goes even further with a more fundamental analysis of these mysterious compositions. Some of Yoshida's most interesting writing concerns Ozu's increasingly total avoidance of any easily identifiable symbolism. He was extremely careful about insert shots, whether they were of landscapes or objects, and was intent on making their originating point of view as ambiguous as possible. These insert shots are not the subjective views of any of his characters. They do not indicate Ozu-san's point of view. They are not prepared to stimulate the viewer's emotional involvement with the film. They are simply shots from a completely anonymous viewpoint. No one can possess and claim them. Ozu-san refused to assign any meanings to these anonymous shots. Therefore, we can only explain them with limitlessly uncertain meanings, and then conclude that the landscapes and artifacts in these shots are in fact looking at the film's characters, Ozu-san, and all the human beings, including his viewers, not the other way round. We find a pleasure in watching his films, not in looking for certain meanings on the screen of lights and shadows, but in getting absorbed in temporal illusions and in accepting the chaotic world as it is, as Ozu-san did. Yoshida reframes Ozu's work as cinematically subversive. After all, if carefully crafted symbolism, drama, continuity and sentiments are the stuff of cinema, then Ozu is anti-cinema, he concludes. To the new wave directors who found his passive camera stultifying, dictatorial control of performances, and avoidance of grand themes or political statements as an extreme endpoint to the old-fashioned conservative approaches, then this reframing is revelatory. Rather than seeking to explode or supercharge the form of film to energise themes and confront viewers with new subject matter or more intellectualised viewpoints as the new wave directors did, Ozu one-ups them by simply disregarding all of these elements. It's tempting to look back at the image of Michiko submissively wandering into an unhappy future and imbue it with the nihilism that Yoshida imagines Ozu felt the first time he looked through a camera lens. To think of the chaotic world Ozu felt it would be naive and dishonest to reshape into digestible sentiments, to politicise, subjectify or deconstruct. Are Michiko and her father conscious of the chaotic world? Is the subjugation of self-agency, in fact, a dignified resignation to endless chaos?